Anyway, let's get to our next guest here on this edition of the StuphFile program, shall we? In one of the recent terror attacks in London, a rented van was driven into a crowd, leaving a mosque during Ramadan. That just weeks after terrorists drove into pedestrians walking across London Bridge, and in New York City's Times Square, a drunk driver slammed into pedestrians who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It seems the simple act of walking on the sidewalk has become more dangerous than ever. Former British Army officer Chris Bird says everyone needs to be aware of their surroundings at all times, but not to succumb to fear. Bird is the author of Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage. He joins us on the line from San Antonio. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Peter. Pleasure to be with you.
Nice to have you on the program. That line that we have to be aware of our surroundings at all times, but not succumb to fear, that's a thin line to walk across. How do you find the balance?
I guess you don't want to become paranoid where everything is a threat, but on the other hand, you do want to take certain precautions. One of the things that I find most distressing is the number of people you see walking along the street or driving who have their face in a cell phone. They're texting, they're talking, they're paying absolutely no attention to what's going on around them. And this is dangerous. 99 times out of 100, there'll be no problem. But I know my wife even tends to answer the phone compulsively, even when she's driving. And when I'm in her car, I can tell the difference. She'll miss a turning. She'll maybe change lanes without looking. I kind of cringe a little, but I guess I've got used to it. She's pretty good, but it's things like that we have to be aware of. There are also certain precautions as far as these vehicles are concerned. It seems that the bigger the vehicle, the more damage, the more casualties there are. And I noticed it was interesting that a couple of these things in Britain happened on bridges where there is nowhere to go. If you're walking down a street, always try and face the traffic so you have a little bit more warning if somebody is coming, driving a vehicle onto the sidewalk. You can see it before it actually happens or while it's happening. Another thing is if you're walking down the street, if you happen to see that there is parking on one side but not on the other, and a string of cars parked will prevent another vehicle from getting onto the sidewalk. So you're safer on the sidewalk that has cars parked alongside it.
Now, I think part of the situation too is, thankfully, knock on wood, we live in a country, we live on a continent that, for the most part, has been relatively terrorist-free. I bring up that point only because I remember back in the day, back when I first started in radio, I was working in a newsroom, and it was in the 80s, and I remember something coming over the wire. It was a story about a crowded mall in Israel where a gunman had opened fire and had killed only 14 people. And I say only 14 people because it immediately struck me that if that had been a similar situation in Canada or the United States where it was a crowded mall, the first inclination when somebody hears any kind of a noise, a shot of some kind, is to stop, look around, and see where it's coming from, as opposed to running or dropping or whatever, thereby making more people suspected targets because people were inattentive to what it could possibly be. Is that an accurate assessment?
I think so. It's difficult to be absolutely sure, particularly in a building, in a mall or an airport or something, exactly where a shot's coming from. And before you start running, you really ought to find out which way to run. And the mantra that is now being put forth by the U.S. Homeland Security and Justice Department, the New York City Police, is if you're involved in a mass shooting, you have three options: run, hide, fight. And I found it interesting that the woman, Kathy Lanier, who was the chief of the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, said, "We have told our citizens for decades, don't fight back. Call 911, get out of there, but don't fight back." And now we're telling them fight is one of the options. It's unfortunate that she was actually responsible for issuing concealed carry permits in Washington, and she had turned down 80 of them. So I think to some extent her hypocritical slip was showing. But in Canada, you don't generally have concealed carry. I think this does give you another option, and it certainly makes, if you have to fight, you've got a better weapon than almost anything else if you have a firearm, and it'll usually be a handgun. But even if you don't, there are things that you can do that will help keep you safe. And I think the most important is what we call situational awareness. You have to, the first thing is to be aware of what's going on. If you see something suspicious, depending on what it is, you can report it. This is probably a good thing to report to the police. But if you see, for example, in an airport, somebody putting a bag down and leaving it, I would tend to get as far away from that container as possible.
Okay, well, before just going on that note, you would get as far away from it as possible. Would you also alert someone, like you just said? Would you say to someone, I just saw someone drop that bag there and leave it there, rather than just simply walking away? Would you also inform someone?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But my first, your first responsibility, and this is where I think some people tend to get it a little skewed. Your first responsibility is your own safety. Even if we're talking family members, because you can't help them if you're dead. So priority number one is to stay alive and stay whole as much as possible. Then you can think about helping other people. Although you tend to want to, if there is a bomb explosion or a shooting and there are victims lying all over the place wounded, be very careful before you rush in, even if you're qualified as a paramedic or a doctor or anything like that. Be careful about going in there, because very often one of the things that they use is they'll set off a bomb in one place, wait for first responders to start gathering, and then another bomb will go off and slaughter them. So that's another thing that you have to be a little wary of.
You're the author of Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage. We have had several situations over the last few years in several locations dealing with attempted mass killers or actual mass killers. At what point did you say, I need to write this book and I need to inform people?
Well, what I did, I've the first book I wrote was called The Concealed Handgun Manual, and in its 6th edition, the first chapter was about mass shootings. And when I guess this became more common, I thought, well, this is probably worth a whole book on its own. The subtitle is also indicative of one of the problems, and that is when seconds count, police are still minutes away. You have to rely on yourself to survive. Waiting for the police to come and rescue you or take care of the bad guy is not a good recipe for survival.
Do you find that our somewhat lackadaisical approach, and as you said earlier in the conversation, the idea that people are now walking around with their faces buried in iPhones and not even looking at their surroundings, do you find that we're reaching a point where we're more vulnerable now than we were, say, 5, 10, 15 years ago?
I think that may be true. It's probably a little bit speculative. I certainly don't have any statistics to back that up, but I do get the impression that that particularly cell phones are they're an advantage, but they're also a disadvantage. And a lot of people particularly people who depend on the cell phone for their living, on always being in contact, they cannot hear the cell phone go off without answering it. And I think this is often a mistake. I won't drive and talk on a cell phone. I know that a lot of people do, but it means that you're trying to multitask, and I'm old enough and honest enough, I guess, to realize that my multitasking isn't that great.
The book is called Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage. It's written by Chris Bird. Chris, I thank you very, very much for taking the time to be on the program with us. It's been most valuable information that you've been sharing.
Well, thank you, Peter. I enjoyed it.
Chris Bird, author of Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage. You can go to my website at StuphFile.com, check out the show number for this program, which is show number 0412, and you'll find links to Chris's website, plus links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order his book directly.